carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. And secondly, from the Message, and you can actually find it on the front of your bulletins, and it reads, "Pray for the peace and prosperity of your city. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper."
Morning. Well, I must have been very nervous to get up here this morning because I tried to put 2 belts on my jeans this morning. I was looking for my belt and I could not find it, so I found my grandpa's old belt that doesn't fit the way I want it to. So I started trying to do up this belt, and Jess looks at me, she's like, "You fool." She's like, "You already have a belt on." Whatever. But today, we're going to be talking about the city. It's a topical sermon today. We're going to be going through lots of scriptures, but the city, what the Bible views the city as. Specifically, why would God, through the prophet Jeremiah, give this imperative command to the exiles, to Babylon, God's great enemy, right? Well, historically speaking, we know that after exile, there was a large enough number of Israelites in Babylon that they were able to get out from imperial rule and have their own nation state, and eventually they would go under another imperial power, Rome, Greece, and then Rome after that. Before in Jeremiah, when the book starts, King Jehoiakim, he's playing some political roulette, right? You got Egypt to the south of you, and he's trying to wrestle with them because there's pressures there. Your sister nation Israel has just been taken captive by the Assyrians, and now you have the Babylonians coming in. So he's trying to, but the book of Jeremiah, which it's not specific, it's not a book on, it's about politics, but it's not about real politic, if you know what I mean. Because his main concern about why the people are going into exile is because of their covenant unfaithfulness to God, the breaking of the vows. What is of importance today in this sermon is more theological of concern, though. One of my functions as a missional pastor is to help us think missionally about the places and spaces that God has called us to be. So broadly speaking, we need to talk about the city because that is where we find ourselves. We are placed in the city of Regina, specifically in Argyle Park in Hawkstone. So I'm going to look at 3 things: the importance of the city in the Bible, what challenges are present to us with ministry into the city, and how do we understand our identity in the city. Now the Bible, the biblical view of cities is neither holistic nor romantic, because the city is humanity intensified. You got tons of people in the city, so it's like a magnifying glass. It's intensified. A magnifying glass that brings out the very best and worst of human nature. It has a dual nature. Now the first occurrence of the word city in the Bible is Genesis 4:17. And this is where Cain he murdered his brother, right? Murdered Abel. And then being sent away from the presence of the Lord, he settles east of Eden in the land of Nod. Cain the rebel then builds a city. So after he murders his brother, he goes out, builds a city. There's kind of similarities between if you've studied Roman history, right? Romulus or whatever kills his brother and then founds Rome. So the first constructed city in the Bible was built by a man that has shed blood. But let's not miss the subtleties of the narrative. The founding of the city comes as a result of Cain's search for security in the world, right? He gets a mark on his head, and he's like, how am I going to be protected? The founding of the city comes as a result of Cain's search for security in the world and God granting his request in Genesis 4. In other words, the city is seen as a refuge even from the very beginning. In addition, Genesis 4, chapter 4, verses 17 to 22, links the founding of the city with the beginnings of creation of culture. Immediately after Cain establishes city life, we see the first development of arts in the musicianship of Jubal, and of technology in the tool-making of Tubal-Cain. Architecture, agriculture, the arts, and technology all begin when cities begin. Cities are places of human productivity. However, as can be seen in the line of Cain, the capacities under the influence of sin and rebellion against God can be generators of great evil. The Song of Lamech points to that, right? If Cain is cursed 7 times, I'm basically, I'm more of a killer than that, he says. More of a killer than that. Man, when I read the Bible, this is an aside, I'm just like, how can you not listen to hip-hop music sometimes? It's all there. No, I'm serious. Revenge, blood, like grace, it's just, anyway. You read the Psalms, it's just all, but the Bible paints a very real picture of human beings. It doesn't sugarcoat it. The Song of Lamech, Cain's descendant, shows the Canaanite city dwellers using all their advances to form a human culture of death. Here is the first indicator of the dual nature of the city. Its capability for enormous good, for culture making, creation of art, science, technology, can be used for tremendous evil. For most of the rest of Genesis, the city is seen in a negative light. The city is mentioned in connection with the accursed Ham in Genesis 10, right? Moses' son. Moses gets all hammered up. Hey, Ham. And they're supposed to cover him up with a blanket, but Ham brings about shame because he views his nakedness. Anyway, that's a sermon for another day. But the next substantive appearance is in Genesis 11:4, when the people dwelling in the plain of Shinar gather together to build a city. The naming of Shinar is significant because of its association with Babylon. You can read that in Isaiah 11:11, Daniel 1, verse 2. The building of the city of Babel and its new tower designed to help residents gain an identity apart from the service of God. Here we can see the essence of how cities can magnify our sinful drive for self-glorification and self-salvation. The rest of Genesis highlights the dark side of the city, particularly the infamous Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 18. Now, even though Abraham was called out of the great city of Ur and lived as a nomad, we later read in the scriptures that his longing was for the city of God. In the book of Hebrews, it says, by faith Abraham lived in tents, for he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. In Hebrews 11. So if the city as a social form is intrinsically bad, and I've heard people say that, city's just bad, got to get out of there. If it's intrinsically bad for human beings or for our faith, it wouldn't make sense for it to be idealized as a source of Abraham's sustaining hope. When the Israelites established themselves in the Promised Land, biblical descriptions of cities becomes even more positive. When God settled the Israelites in Canaan, he commanded them to build cities of refuge in Numbers 35. Why? I thought about writing a comic book series, but I'll never do it. But you know about the Avenger of Blood? Numbers? Nobody reads that book, eh? That and Leviticus, like, stay away. But there's cool stuff. The Avenger of Blood. So say somebody murdered your friend or your family member. It was on you. You had the authority to get revenge. But God built these cities and instructed the Israelites to build these cities of refuge where you could go and find sanctuary. Cities with walls and a gathered population could protect an accused person and conduct a trial in a way that villages or rural areas could not. Without cities, a crime or accident could lead to an endless cycle of violence and reprisals. Well, think about it. You killed my brother, I come and kill you, then your brother's coming after me. I mean, Goes on and on and on and on and on. Revenge. Still continues in our world today. Revenge. The safety and density of cities enabled a system of jurisprudence to develop around the rule of law. There, the elders could hear and settle cases in peace. We find that in Deuteronomy 19. God commands the establishment of cities in Israel to establish justice. Unlike Babel, established to make a name for ourselves, Jerusalem, the city of peace, Shalom, becomes the city that's the dwelling place for God's name. This begins when Jerusalem is captured by David in 2 Samuel 5, and the ark is brought to the city. And finally, the temple is built by Solomon. Jerusalem is appointed to be an urban culture that is a witness to the nations and a symbol of the future city of God. From the time of David onwards, the prophets speak of God's future world as an urban society. In the book of Isaiah, Jerusalem, Zion, the mountain, and city, they're interchangeable terms showing the city's centrality in the divine thought and plan. At this point, the spiritual battle lines become clear. The great spiritual conflict is not between city dwellers and country dwellers, but is truly a tale of two cities. It is a struggle between Babylon, representing the city of man, and Jerusalem, representing the city of God. Think about it. In Revelation, John concludes his apocalypse in Revelation 22 by warning those who take words away from the scroll of prophecy that God will take away from their share in the tree of life and in the holy city. It's a beautiful picture John paints of this city, and in the city there's the tree of life and the rivers flowing out. It harkens you right back to Genesis 1. So no, heaven won't necessarily look like Arlington Beach and all beautiful and mountains. I don't know, I'm just kidding. I mean, we do need places to get away though, right? So off of that, if the Bible's got this view of cities, then it's got to be important to our call as Christians. In the verse that Calvin read, the verse before that, verse 6 in Jeremiah, God tells his people to increase in number there. Jess and I are, but now I'm done. Well, Pastor David asked to grow the church. I oblige. And I've totally forgot they stream this online. Oh, I totally forgot they... But increase in number, do not decrease, to retain their distinct community identity and grow. But he also tells them to settle down and engage in the life of the great city. They're to build homes, plant gardens, do life in the city. Most strikingly in that verse, and it's an imperative that God gives through the prophet Jeremiah, so it's a command. It's not if you feel like it. Most strikingly, they're to serve the city. They're to use their resources to benefit the city for the common good. It's not a suggestion to them. It's not a, if you feel like it on Monday, it's a command. In Acts 17, think about it, Paul's missionary journeys. Paul travels to Athens, which is what in the ancient world? It was the intellectual capital, or center of the Greco-Roman world. In Acts 18, he goes to Corinth, one of the commercial centers of the Roman Empire. In Acts 19, he arrives at Ephesus, perhaps the Roman world's religious center. It was the hub of many pagan cults, and particularly the imperial cult, with 3 temples for emperor worship. By the end of Acts, Paul has made it all the way to Rome itself, the empire's capital of military and political power. Paul, when you read Acts, moves deliberately from one strategic center to the next. One strategic center and their cities to the next. John Stott puts it like this: the process of urbanization constitutes a great challenge to the Christian church. On the one hand, there is an urgent need for Christian planners and architects, local government politicians, urban specialists, developers, community social workers who will work for justice, peace, freedom, and beauty in the city. On the other, Christians need to move into the cities and experience the pains and pressures of living there in order to win the city dwellers for Christ. Commuter Christianity living in the suburbs and commuting to an urban church, it's no substitute for incarnational involvement. And we are predominantly a commuter church. People in the world now, overall, are moving into cities of the world many times faster than the church is. People in the world are moving like 10 times faster into cities than the church is. I mean, I think about it like this. When there was a revival in the early 20th century, which sparked, well, this is being streamed online, so I won't say it, but a great revival in this province and whatever. When you look at most of the churches that have been planted around there, that are now dying, by the way, they're all in small towns. They're all in small towns. Small town ministry is difficult. Why? Not a lot of people. It's not saying it's not important. But there's almost this attitude in some circles where it's like we need to get out of the city. You can't reach the city from the suburbs, but you can reach the suburbs from the city. Cities are like a giant heart, drawing people in and then sending them out. Students come to cities. University of Regina, students come from everywhere. Students come to cities to attend school, and then they graduate and move out. Singles meet in the city, get married, and move out to the suburbs when children are born. Immigrants come to the city and live in ethnic enclaves, right? But as they amass assets and become more established in their new country, they move outward to gain additional space for their growing families. In each case, the movement is from the center outward. As a result, a church that thrives in the city will create a community whose members are spread naturally throughout the adjoining region and into other great cities. And now with social media and the internet, it happens so fast. You could be working for one company here in North America where the building is, but your colleague could be working all the way from Tokyo. Now there's some challenges with ministry in the city. Other than churches not being there in the city, is churches that it's you need to have churches that are gospel focused. The gospel in Jesus Christ needs to be the primary message. Many people in cities, including Christians, functionally live as if they are saved by their works. What do I mean by that? I'll show you. I've probably used this illustration before, but it's like if you saw me sitting down at the Cornwall Center in front of A&W just wolfing down 2 things of onion rings because they're so good and having a breakfast sandwich, and I'm reading a book about like eating a healthy diet, like on the ketogenic diet or whatever's out there. And I'm like, yeah, this is really good. This is true. Well, how is it true, Sean? I'm thinking up here that it's right, but functionally how I'm living, it's not the same. There's a disconnect. It's almost like this ironic gesture that I'm playing out to you. Isn't it ironic that he thinks he believes, eating healthy is good as he wolfs down a double mama matzo burger? Now, what do I mean, functionally live as they are saved by their works? Or saved by who they know? A lot of us can live lives where we're doing a lot of good things. And it becomes, and it's searching your own heart, but you almost get the attitude of, or do you have the attitude of, that's why God has to save me. Look at all the good that I'm doing. Look what I do. And that's a city attitude, right? If you're at work and you're in a workplace and say you're looking for that promotion, right? And you know you deserve it. And then you don't get it. Mad. You need to know, gospel focused is, you need to know and recognize and know deep within yourself that you are blood bought. That you are blood bought. That it's by sheer grace and grace alone. And if that becomes the ministry focus, it will run good in your life. Even as a minister, though, I live as though it's by my good works that I'm saved. Sometimes I do. Lots. If you want to figure it out, if you're there, what your idols are, what do you think about the most? What do you dwell on all the time? St. Augustine put it this way: our hearts are restless until they find rest in you. That's biblical. St. Augustine says, basically the problem is that our loves are out of order. And if you want to discover if your loves are out of order, just ask yourself, what do I think the most about? Is it that I'm blood-bought, saved by grace, bought with a price, precious? I didn't do anything to earn it? Or is it, I do a lot of good, therefore God needs to bless me? And that's a hyperbole I'm using. Or we can develop Christian enclaves, escapism I call it. We want to escape out to the suburbs, but even while in the city, we can have an attitude that says something like this: the world is evil, the city. Look at the poverty, crime, injustice, etc., etc., etc. We need to stay away or else we'll become corrupted by it. Think about it. When they built Bible colleges at this time of revival here in Saskatchewan, they didn't build them here in Regina or in Saskatoon or anything like that. They moved them out. And when you study the history of it, it was because they didn't want their students being corrupted by what was going on in the city. Well, how are you going to train people to do evangelism in the city if you push them all the way out to the outskirts? Pretty tough, in my opinion. So instead of being a city on a hill, Matthew 5, Jesus, you are a city on a hill. We do what Jesus told us not to do, and we cover up our lights. And this push too far can lead to legalism. I'm saved by what I do and don't do, who I hang out with, my family connections, etc., etc. Again, the gospel needs to be preached to our hearts. It's not who you hang out with or whom you stay away from what things you do or don't do that save you. You're blood-bought. It's sheer grace. And out of that sheer grace, I better say this: you don't do certain things and you do certain things. But you don't do, does that make sense? Okay. Without the gospel being ministered to our hearts, we teeter between these two, of legalism and relativism. Even I see emotionalism at times. I'm saved by how passionate I am and how sold out I am for Jesus. Well, I went to a Pentecostal church for a long time, love it. And I used to be, just right at the front row, jumping and everything like that. God had saved my life, okay? It was radical. Then came to a point a few years into my walk where like those feelings weren't there anymore, and I would try to pretend to drum them up, you know what I mean? So I'd be like, well, maybe if I just act like it's a jump and everything like that, but then it started to feel just fake. Then I'm like, well, what's going on, Lord? Like, how come I don't feel this need to or this desire to want to do that? And the gospel is preached to me. Sean, I love you not because of how you jump or cry. I love you because I made you. You're fearfully and wonderfully made, and it's sheer grace that I saved you. You were bought by a price, my own precious blood. Like the song we sang, it's like, he doesn't hide to tease us. He came down, God came down to earth and shed his own blood, his own begotten son. That has to be ministered to your hearts. Better move fast or else we'll be here forever. Without the gospel ministered to your hearts, we teeter between these things, and before you know it, all of a sudden we're more formed and shaped by the cultural practices in the city than we are shaping it. And it just happens. Sometimes you don't even realize it. It happens to me. We're having 2 more kids. First thought in my mind is I didn't even ask God to help me. I'm being honest with you. It was like, I need to get a better paying job. That's it. It's all on me. I gotta save myself. Nobody's gonna come in and save me. Nobody's coming to rescue me. How far did I go down that trail of leaving behind my blood-bought Savior, for me? If you're shaped by the culture, you won't be able to minister to the poor effectively. Especially if your gospel is abstaining from people that you consider unclean. See Peter's vision in the book of Acts, right? Peter struggled in his ministry in the book of Acts to begin with. Why? Didn't want to go to the Gentiles. Why? Because they ate unclean food. Can't be around them or else I'm going to be unclean for a certain amount of days. Then I got to go back to the temple to sacrifice, It was like an inconvenience for him. Like God, it was so bad for Peter, God had to send him like a vivid dream, just, showing him all kinds of foods, being like, eat it, man. You're not going to die from it. So if your gospel is legalism, you won't even hang out with those people. They're unclean. At the same time, if your gospel is relativism, then your ministry may have people doing good things in regards to justice, but they believe they're saved by it. And truth be told, doing justice ministry or ministries of mercy will burn you out, because what actually sustains you is the gospel of Jesus Christ. For example, I work for an organization that does great missions of mercy and justice in our city. But when it comes time to have chapel or any kind of church services, it's empty. And I'm not saying that's anybody's fault. What I'm saying is sometimes I think we teeter on these lines. But we have to have, like, if you look at the Gospels being like scalpel, the tip of that scalpel of your ministry has to be the gospel. Because if it's blunt, it's going to make no impact at all. So do we reach a lot of people with feeding them and housing them and stuff like that? Absolutely. But do I see those same people coming back 3 months later? Yep. Our identity. I'm going to close with this. During the exile, Israel no longer existed in the form of a nation state with a government and laws. Instead, it existed as a countercultural fellowship contained with other nation states. In many ways, this is also the form of the New Testament church. As Peter and James suggest when they address us believers as the dispersion, James 1:1, and exiles in 1 Peter 1:1. Twice Peter uses a Greek word that is often translated as resident aliens. Resident aliens were citizens of one country, yet full-time residents of another. Their primary allegiance was to another country, and that country's culture was formative for their beliefs and practices. Yet they lived in their country of residence as full participants in its life. In other words, resident aliens lived neither as natives nor as tourists. Though they were not permanently rooted, neither were they merely just travelers who were just passing through. You and I are just not passing through Regina. Christians, us, are now considered citizens of the New Jerusalem that is above. Galatians 4, Philippians 3. We're a town built on a hill. Matthew 5. We are a city within a city. Even Paul uses the word ambassador. What does that mean? An ambassador. Well, as an ambassador, whatever country you're in, you better know how to speak that language, right? So if I'm an ambassador to the Philippines, I better know how to speak Tagalog, and I better like Laganisa and Tocino and all this good Filipino food. There's no Filipinos here, but I love that stuff. Whatever. So you know the language, you know the culture, you know the customs and whatnot, but as an ambassador, you also know that's not my primary allegiance in this other country. It's the country I'm representing. Peter also warns, and Jesus will always live with both praise and misunderstanding as these ambassadors, as these citizens. Jesus taught that Christians are to do good that's to be visible to the pagans in Matthew 5:16, right? Jesus said, if you only do good to those who do good to you, what difference is that from what the culture is already doing? It's no different. But he also warns his followers to expect misunderstanding and persecution. Have you ever forgiven a coworker at work, but everybody's mad at that person? And then all of a sudden, the Holy Spirit starts speaking to you, and it's like, you better go reconcile, or brings up a verse like in Romans, as far as it concerns you, be at peace with everyone. And then you go and make peace with that person, and then you've kind of divided the office a little bit. Because now the people that thought that you were on their side are like, you're not. No, it's never happened. Oh, man, it's happened. Oh, I pray that happens to you. You have fun with that experience. But you're called to be, these peace bringers. You're called to be these ambassadors, and you're going to be misunderstood by it. In a similar way, Peter calls Christians to live in the midst of pagan society in such a way that others will see their good deeds and glorify God. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 12. But he warns them to expect persecution nonetheless. During the exiles, the Jews were to increase in number by having children. Jeremiah 29:6. The church must also multiply and increase in the city as God's new humanity. But this happens primarily not by having twins like Jesse, but it happens primarily and especially through evangelism and discipleship. It happens by evangelism and discipleship. In the Old Testament, I'll close with this, the nations were called to come in and worship God, come see Jerusalem. But in the New Testament, our mission is to move outward with the gospel. Meaning what? It has to affect how you work. It has to affect every area of your life. Again, the scalpel. If it's not at the point, it's not going to cut in. Why isn't my work life changing and whatnot? Well, maybe the gospel's not at the forefront. Why do I feel frustrated sometimes with my job when I help house people and then they come back? Well, maybe the gospel, Sean, just isn't at the forefront. Because I can get so discouraged to the point where it's just like I want to quit. Because fundamentally, as I explore my heart, I'm like, well, I think I'm saved because of the work that I do. Being totally honest, confessing in front of people, Like sometimes I go to bed, I'm like, man, if I die, he's got to let me into heaven. I've seen too much. Well, when you're in the city, though, you will be embedded in it. And that comes with good and bad things, doesn't it? When I go to the hospital, like when I had my stomach pain, all right, and I'm laying in there waiting for them to get a morphine drip into me because I'm in such pain, Jess remembers, there's a guy laying right beside me that I know, drunk, Sean, help me! And I'm in no position to help him. I'm thinking I'm going to die. I'm like, I can't help you. Just close the curtain. I can't deal with it. Or I take my little daughter to the hospital. She had a stomach ache. What's up with us and stomach aches? We need to drink Metamucil, Jess, every morning. Well, because Adia was just gas. But we're in there, and I'm holding my little daughter. And, yep, here's people that I know. John, I took my puffer like 80 times. I think I'm having a reaction to it. And I'm not a doctor. And I'm not any more educated. There's way more educated people than me, for sure, or special or smarter than any of you. What I'm trying to show you in my example, what my work does intentionally, is that it just puts me in contact with people. I can't just drive away out of it. I shop here. I live here. My kids go to school here. I work here. My friends are here. I'll close with this, Psalm 107. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. Let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story. What's your story? The gospel message. What is it? How many people have you told? Not in an oppressive way or a triumphant way, but when they ask you, who are you? What do you say? A lot of times I tell people, yeah, I'm saved by grace. I tell them, yeah, I became a Christian. I've been laughed at. It is what it is. It's my story. One time I told a guy, you're laughing at that? What if I laughed at your story now? It just ended. What if I laughed in your face, right? It's rude. Anyway. Let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story. Those he redeemed from the hand of the foe. You have been plucked from death. How do you know that? Because Jesus rose from the dead. Death is not the final note in your song. I'm getting the light flicker here, so I'm wrapping it up. Time to go. Those he gathered from the lands, from east and west, from north and south. Some wandered in desert wastelands, finding no way to a city where they could settle. They were hungry and thirsty, and their lives ebbed away. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. He led them by a straight way to a city where they could settle. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for humankind. For he satisfies the thirsty and fills the hungry with good things. Let's partner with Jesus' mission and his kingdom. Amen. Thank you.